Welcome to our next session of the day. One quick announcement before we get started. Night at the Museum is back. This year it's at the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian. It's at 6:15. Shuttle buses will be leaving from this building and they come back and forth all night. So please check that out if you're able to. I'd like to introduce our next speakers, Raymond Leong, Brendan McKeag.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Quick introduction. My name is Raymond Leong. I'm a staff reverse engineer on the Flare team. And on the Flare team, one of our key workflows is providing in-depth malware reverse engineering to both Mandiant and now broader Google teams.
My name is Brendan McKeag. I'm a manager on advanced practices, where we provide frontline threat intelligence support to our Mandiant incident response consultants and our managed defense analysts.
Over the last year, our teams have worked together to support over 50 investigations into a long-running USB-based campaign by Chinese threat actors. This campaign is notable for one, it's the resurgence of an infection vector that most modern organizations thought mitigated. Two, the geography of this campaign, as observed by Mandiant frontline data. And three, the continued adaptation of SOGU, a long-running and prominent backdoor primarily associated with Chinese espionage.
In this presentation, we're going to cover USB as an infection vector in 2022. Then we're going to introduce a prolific Chinese state-sponsored threat actor we track as UNC53. We'll discuss UNC53's 4 campaigns they've had over the last 2 years, and then we'll focus specifically on UNC53's USB campaign. Ray will then introduce the SOGU malware family, and he'll dive deep into the 3 SOGU variants UNC53 used in their USB campaign. We'll discuss detection opportunities and threat intelligence challenges, and then we'll wrap it up with a review and outlook of USB-based intrusions in 2023. In 2022, Mandiant observed a dramatic increase in USB-based infections. From 2021 to 2022, we saw a more than 3,000% increase in these infections. And on the front lines, we responded to 300 USB-based intrusions in 2022 that affected 109 victim organizations by 19 distinct threat clusters. Now, in the years prior to 2021, going all the way back to 2015, Mandiant was only responding to 3 or less of these USB-based intrusions per year. This led us to ask the question, what threat actors are responsible for this uptick in USB-based operations, and what are their motivations? Now, when we split by motivation what sort of threat actors are conducting these operations, in 2022, 85% was comprised of financially motivated threat actors. And while that seems drastically higher than espionage, it is worth noting that in 2022, Mandiant was tracking a threat actor, UNC3840, publicly known as Raspberry Robin, who was responsible for 240 of these intrusions. This widespread activity appeared anomalous to us and was really a spike in activity that we're not going to see year in and year out. But still, when we dive into the espionage-related threat actors who are using this infection vector, it's still a massive increase. From 2021 to 2022, more than 1,400%. And when we look at all of the espionage clusters who have used USB-based operations, in 2022, 97% were Chinese threat actors. And out of all of the Chinese threat actors who use this infection vector, the most prolific was UNC53, with the longest running USB campaign. That's why we're talking about them today. Now, UNC53 is a Chinese espionage group with other public names such as Tempex, and our UNC53 cluster shares substantial overlaps with what other companies track as Anchor Panda, Earth Preda, and Mustang Panda. To be clear, these clusters are not one-to-one with our UNC53 cluster. It's just worth noting there are substantial overlaps. Now at Mandiant, our earliest intrusion that we've attributed to UNC53 goes all the way back to May of 2011. And our most recent activity attributed to UNC53 was just 2 weeks ago. It shows the timely nature of this presentation. It was, in fact, this USB-based campaign that we're talking about today. UNC53 is a prolific actor. They've had 4 campaigns over the last 2 years. Now at Mandiant, we define a campaign as an impactful intrusion by a threat actor with a singular objective that affects multiple victims within a relevant time period. UNC53's first campaign, 22033, began in June of 2022. This was a spear phishing campaign targeting government organizations in Eastern Europe and the Asia-Pacific regions. UNC53 sent phishing emails that contained a Google Drive link, which led to a RAR file leading to a backdoor. UNC53's second campaign, 22054, this is the USB campaign that we're talking about today, where infected USBs were spreading 3 different variants of SOGU. Their third campaign, 23014, this was another phishing campaign targeting government organizations in Europe. UNC53 was sending spear phishing emails masquerading as European diplomatic entities using Outlook email addresses, and the emails contained a OneDrive link leading to a RAR file, ultimately leading to another variant of SOGU. Finally, their most recent campaign, 23032, again, another phishing campaign targeting government organizations in Europe, where the phishing emails contained an HTML file with embedded JavaScript, leading to a variant of SOGU. And when we step back and look at all these campaigns, this illustrates why Mandiant tracks campaigns the way we do. We're able to better track threat actors, and there are slight changes to targeting or slight changes in the TTPs. But today, we're here to talk about campaign 22054, their USB-based campaign. And when you look at the time mark, we see that this is the longest running campaign that they've had, beginning in January of 2022 up until this month. Now, this USB-based campaign, Mandiant has responded to 50 intrusions that have affected 29 victim organizations across 28 industries throughout 16 countries. Our first response in this campaign began in January of 2022. Now, at the time, this was a singular intrusion, so it was not yet a campaign. It's not uncommon for Mandiant to respond to a SOGU-based intrusion by a suspected Chinese threat actor. 3 months later, by the end of Q1, in March of 2022, we had responded to 4 of these intrusions. This was followed by a lull throughout the summer months. And it wasn't until October of 2022 where we saw an uplift in this activity. Interestingly, we began to see a trend of a concentration of infected hosts throughout Africa. Specifically, we saw these intrusions in Egypt, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, and Madagascar. Now, while some of these intrusions were at victims that are headquartered in these African countries, something interesting began to bubble up. As some intrusions were going along, what we thought were UNC53 intrusions targeting European organizations, as the intrusions progressed, these European victims were coming back to us and they were telling us, this is a remote worker that operates in the Central Africa region, or this is a network engineer in Ghana, or this is a remote employee in Zimbabwe. This began to happen over and over where it started to produce a trend. By December of 2022, we saw another uptick in activity, and we officially declared it campaign 22054. By March of 2023, we found another interesting piece of information. Victims were coming back to us, and they were telling us of the suspected locations where the USBs were being infected prior to being brought into the customer environment. Specifically, we had multiple cases where victims were telling us that it was print shops in Ghana. And in one particular instance, a victim came back to us and gave us the specific address of an internet cafe in the Robert Mugabe Airport in Zimbabwe. Now, if we think about this as an infection point, we have individuals coming into an airport. They're going to travel throughout the region or even internationally outside of the continent to Europe or other continents. Now, in September of 2023, this was our most recent intrusion. It happened 2 weeks ago. This managed defense customer was based in Madagascar, continuing the trend of a focus of this activity in the Africa region. Now we'll cover the infection chain of this USB-based campaign, mapping it to the attack lifecycle. Initial compromise occurs when an infected USB drive is inserted into a host. Foothold is established when a victim executes a legitimate file, which then loads a malicious DLL via search order hijacking, which then loads the SOGU payload and executes in memory. Persistence is maintained when the SOGU malware is then copied to the host and a registry run key is created. Internal recon occurs when host recon commands are executed. The SOGU malware then searches for documents and it stages them for data theft. Lateral movement occurs when a new uninfected USB is inserted into an infected host. And if that USB is plugged into another system in the victim environment, that is how this infection spreads. Finally, mission is complete when the data is exfiltrated to the SOGU C2. Now that we've covered the infection chain at a high level, I'll pass it over to Ray, who will introduce the SOGU malware family and then dive deep into the 3 SOGU variants UNC53 used in this campaign.
So we'll start with a primer on the SOGU backdoor, and then we'll dive into the specific USB-based variant seen in this recent campaign. SOGU is a backdoor written in C, and it extends its functionality using plugins. And a plugin exists for a wide array of functionality, ranging from simple actions on disk, like file upload and download, to more niche, like querying that targets SQL databases. At Mandiant, we track this malware family as SOGU, but it's also publicly known as PlugX, CorePlug, DestroyRat. And this is a long-running backdoor. Mandiant first saw it in 2009 at an incident response at a Western European financial services firm. And that intrusion was attributed to a different long-running Chinese threat group. SOGU first started being used by a small group of Chinese actors, and due to relationships between Chinese actors, the malware was spread and distributed, and that led to us seeing SOGU over time being used among a broader and broader swath of Chinese threat groups. Recent external reporting suggests that the SOGU source code may have been leaked, and actors outside of Chinese threat groups may now have access. When SOGU was first seen in the late 2000s, this was a cutting-edge backdoor. This is a modular backdoor of plugin architecture, multi-threaded with deep capability. Over time, it's been updated and improved, and although it still has its weaknesses, it's still successfully used in intrusions in present day. So some of SOGU's greatest hits include the intrusion at the Office of Personnel Management, where the security clearances for over 20 million employees, government employees, were stolen. That intrusion involved the use of SOGU. Some of the largest telecoms across the globe have had intrusions involving the use of SOGU, as have had many government agencies, defense, and tech firms. And chances are greater than not, if there's an industry sector that has information of importance to the Chinese government, that industry sector has had an intrusion involving the use of SOGU. To share some context with Mandiant frontline data, Mandiant has responded to 110 organizations that were compromised, including the use of SOGU. We're tracking 46 groups that have used SOGU, and we're tracking 56 variants of SOGU. Like Brendan stated, just this last month, Mandiant responded to 2 organizations that were compromised through the use of SOGU. Now, diving into the specific UNC53 USB-based campaign, Mandiant investigated 50 compromised hosts from this campaign, and we identified 3 specific SOGU USB variants, and they're shown on the right, ordered by prevalence. SOGU WD was the most common, followed by JSPS and SOGU UTM. So for the first 2 variants, these are purpose-built SOGU variants meant to propagate over USB and perform data collection and exfiltration over USB. And they're specifically designed to perform data theft over air-gapped networks. Quick refresher, an air-gap is a security measure meant to isolate critical or sensitive systems away from untrusted networks, like the internet or a local untrusted network. And in these variants, the threat actors use classic core SOGU backdoor code and integrated that purpose-built USB functionality. SOGU UTM, the 3rd variant we saw, this is most similar to classic SOGU. There's 13 embedded plugins, and within the keylogger plugin, the threat actors added that purpose-built USB data theft functionality into it. and this variant doesn't contain self-contained propagation over USB. So let's go over how this SOGU USB-based malware works. We'll use SOGU WD as our example, and we'll cover the important differences in other variants afterwards. So first, when an infected USB drive is inserted into the victim system, in that root directory, there is a decoy executable launcher. Now, this does not automatically execute. It requires the victim to execute it. But when it does, this decoy launcher executes a legitimate executable. And through DLL search order hijacking, the threat actors place their malicious DLL in the same hidden folder, and this executes instead. And this malicious DLL loads a third hidden file. This is the encrypted SOGU backdoor on disk. It loads it into memory, decrypts it, and executes it. And in this way, the SOGU backdoor only exists decrypted in memory, and it's loaded in the context of a high reputation process. So after it executes, it decrypts its configuration, more on that later, and then it copies itself from the USB to the host system, and then it creates persistence through the Windows auto-run registry key, and then it relaunches itself. And when it relaunches itself, it deletes earlier SOGU USB infections, killing specific processes, deleting specific hard-coded file names, and that's also a way for it to delete earlier versions of this malware. After that's done, it begins to propagate to each connected USB drive. So it enumerates USB drives, it deletes SOGU infections on those USB drives, and then in the root directory, it creates a hidden recyclers bin folder. And what's interesting is, inside that folder, they create a desktop INI file, and the contents of that file associate this hidden recyclers bin folder to the host actual recycle bin. So if the victim were to try to open this folder, they redirect it to the host actual recycle bin. So this protects the folder, and the malware copies the SOGU files into this folder. The decoy launcher is then copied to the root directory, and then it's renamed as a decoy name. If that USB disk has a custom or specific volume name, it uses that. Or if not, it uses the removable disk, the free space on that USB exe. So at this point, once the USB malware has propagated, the USB drive is infected, when a victim inserts it into another system, executes it, that continues the USB SOGU malware campaign. So here's a screenshot of an infected USB drive. The first file is that decoy executable launcher. The second file is a hidden folder made to look like a disk icon. Some variants will copy stolen files to that folder. And that third folder is that recyclers bin folder, where if a victim tries to open the folder, they're redirected to the host actual recycle bin. But if we use a tool like the Windows command prompt, we can see that's actually where the copied SOGU malware files exist. So after propagation, the malware checks if it's on an air-gapped network. And this is to, one, either steal files on that air-gapped system, or two, copy stolen files on those infected USB drives and exfiltrate them to the SOGU C2 server. So it performs this check by attempting to connect to Microsoft.com or checking for the presence of a specific registry key. And that registry key is only going to be there if the malware was executed with a specific command line argument. If these checks fail, it assumes it's on an air-gapped network, and it performs system recon and data theft of files on that air-gapped system, copying into each USB drive. So files are copied to that hidden recyclers bin folder under a subfolder using a randomly generated victim ID. It performs host and network reconnaissance on that host, saving it to that USB exfil directory. And then it searches for specific file types underneath approximately 300 megabytes. If it finds it, it XOR encrypts it with a hard-coded key, storing it to that USB exfiltration directory. And then it beacons to the C2 server, awaiting a successful connection. So at this point, files from that air-gapped host are copied onto the USB drive, and if a victim inserts it into a system with an internet connection, or if that C2 beacon is successful, this is what happens next. The malware identifies stolen files on that USB on one of 3 hidden folders. It copies it to that host system in a specific staging directory. And then it beacons to the SOGU C2 server. And the backdoor has full capabilities to then exfiltrate those stolen air-gapped files. Communication with the C2 server is largely determined by its configuration. And for these purpose-built USB variants, the threat actors streamline these custom SOGU builds. So we see things like the configuration for this SOGU variant is very simplified. Just C2 servers, mutex name, auto-run registry key. Communication is over TCP or HTTP. Support for other protocols have been removed. And SOGU is traditionally known as a plugin-based backdoor, where backdoor functionality resides in the appropriate plugin. But for these variants, the threat actors took functionality out of the plugins that they needed and integrated it into that core backdoor. So on the screenshot on the right is the area of code within this variant that receives a command from the C2 server, decrypts it, and parses the command and executes the appropriate command. The first highlighted block is hex 7002. That's a classic SOGU reverse shell command, and that command and the associated code have been taken from the plugin and integrated into the core backdoor. The second highlighted block, hex 3000, that's the classic SOGU disk plugin, and that provides the backdoor full file and directory management capabilities. That's been taken from that plugin, integrated to the core backdoor, and it allows the threat actors full capability to then exfiltrate those stolen files from the air-gapped system. Its C2 protocol is largely unmodified from the classic SOGU backdoor. So for TCP, data is either encrypted and compressed using a slightly modified SOGU algorithm, and then that classic SOGU header on the right is prepended to the encrypted or compressed data, and that's sent to the C2 server. For HTTP, it communicates with its C2 server using HTTP post request and custom headers, and that encrypted data is sent in the body of the post request. And this harkens back to the good old days where malware would use symmetric encryption to encrypt its C2 traffic. So malware as a whole has evolved to use asymmetric encryption. So unless we can recover the private key, we generally can't decrypt it. But when symmetric encryption is in play, we can reverse it and decrypt the C2 traffic. In fact, Flare has a framework to automatically decrypt network traffic from backdoors that use symmetric encryption. And this is where SOGU is starting to show its age. When threat actors reuse these classic frameworks, their vulnerabilities and weaknesses are carried forward into present day. As SOGU is updated, modified, and improved, we needed a way to track different SOGU versions. So some of those ways have been the specific configuration type unique to that variant, the specific date value initially present in that SOGU C2 header, or the custom header it creates when it communicates over HTTP. For each of these 3 variants, they create specific custom headers over HTTP, and that's what's highlighted in the screenshot here. And that's also how they derive their names for their variant. So we went over how SOGU WD executes, and we'll quickly highlight some important differences in the other 2 variants. For SOGU JSPS, it deletes additional SOGU USB infections, and we think it might be an updated variant. For C2 traffic, it uses RC4 with a hard-coded key instead of custom XOR. Like you saw on the last slide, it creates a custom HTTP header. And I think most interestingly is it attempts to reestablish the internet connection if it thinks it's in an air-gapped system. And this is how it does it. So if its internet connectivity check fails, it uses a UAC bypass to execute a scheduled task. And that's what we see on the first graphic. On the second graphic is the scheduled task it executes. It attempts to re-enable the wireless network adapter. And if this is successful and it's able to re-enable the internet connection on a poorly configured air-gapped system, it can then exfiltrate those files from the air-gapped system to the SOGU C2 server. The third and last variant we saw was SOGU UTM. This is most similar to the classic SOGU backdoor. It has 13 embedded plugins. And this version doesn't have USB self-propagation or data theft from the host, but custom code was added to the SOGU keylogger plugin to perform USB data exfiltration of files stored on infected USB drives and to delete SOGU infections on USB drives. And also interestingly is this additional custom code doesn't match the rest of the SOGU keylogger plugin, but the coding and the artifacts of that code closely align with SOGU WD and JSPS. On the left is a screenshot of a standard SOGU keylogger plugin, and on the right is a screenshot of that plugin in SOGU UTM. The highlighted blocks are the function calls that execute that purpose-built USB functionality, and those arrows show where they've been inserted into a standard SOGU keylogger plugin. So the last few slides went over the malware's execution, its functionality, and now let's talk about how we can detect this malware. As a quick refresher, the malware uses DLL search order hijacking, and that means at the end of its execution phase, the SOGU backdoor only exists decrypted in memory, so we'll focus detections before SOGU execution memory. So for DLL search order hijacking, the threat actors use a legitimate executable. And in fact, in this campaign, over 50 intrusions that we saw in managed defense, they used just 4 specific executables and primarily just 2 with consistent file names. So these are legitimate executables. These are signed applications, and we can write detections focused on execution of these executables, their files, these files and file names outside of their expected directories. Similar to that malicious DLL. Now, although the file hash will change, the file name will not, so we can focus detections of this DLL being loaded outside of its expected directory and chain it with logic like a missing or invalid digital signature. And here are some examples of Mandiant managed defense using these detections to catch this activity. So here is that legitimate Adobe file. It's being written to unexpected file location. In fact, here it's trying to copy itself to disk. It's catching that. Another example, here is that same reused legitimate Adobe application executing from a USB drive. Managed defense is catching that. Second highlighted block is that malicious DLL also being executed outside of its expected directory from the USB drive. Another detection opportunity exists in that malicious DLL. So when that malicious DLL is called, the legitimate executable calls a hard-coded export. And the screenshots show 4 different UNC53 launchers used in this campaign, and the red highlighted block is the export that's called. And that loads and decrypts the encrypted SOGU backdoor on disk. And we can write a signature detection for that export, chain it with logic like an incorrect or missing digital signature, and we can identify this malicious DLL. The threat actors try to hide this, the specific export of importance with these junk DLL exports. They don't perform any meaningful functionality, and we can ignore those. Another detection opportunity exists in the loader for SOGU UTM. And that screenshot there is the unique decryption algorithm to load and decrypt the SOGU backdoor. And in fact, that's a variation of the classic SOGU decryption algorithm. And it's also used not just to decrypt the SOGU payload, but to encrypt and decrypt network traffic. And it's unique, and that's great for us as it's a nice signature opportunity. On the network level, we talked about how each variant creates custom HTTP headers. And this screenshot here shows Mandiant managed defense catching the initial connection attempt of a SOGU JSPS variant trying to beacon to its C2 server. The second highlighted block shows those unique HTTP headers. These last few detections have focused on the malware itself. Now Brendan's going to continue detections across the broader intrusion chain.
Now we'll map detection opportunities to the attack lifecycle. For initial compromise, we're looking for ROT13 encoded LNK files in the roots of D, E, or F drives. For establishing foothold, we're looking for a process launching from a path-containing recycler.bin. For maintaining presence, we're looking for a registry run key for an executable and program data. For internal recon, we're looking for the execution of host commands as well as file writes to recycler.bin. For lateral movement, we're looking for SOGU writing malware component files to recycler.bin on newly inserted USBs. And finally, for mission complete, we're looking for HTTP post request with those SOGU header values that Ray just discussed. Now, any of these detection opportunities on their own through each phase of the attack lifecycle is not enough to definitively say there's Chinese state-sponsored threat actors executing a USB-based campaign in an environment. But as we begin to chain these together, and if we pair them with the malware-specific detections that Ray talked about, this is a pretty decent detection fingerprint for this type of activity. Of course, the question remains, what happened before the USB was inserted into the customer environment? Going back to the examples of victims coming to us and telling us that it was a print shop in Ghana or it was an internet cafe in the airport in Zimbabwe, if we're not conducting the forensic investigation, we can't validate that. Of course, at Mandiant, we chase down every lead we have. For multiple cases where we knew the suspected locations where the USBs were being infected, we attempted to reach out, but it never materialized into an investigation. On to some of the threat intelligence challenges that we face with this type of activity. We'll compare an UNC53 phishing campaign with our UNC53 USB campaign. With a phishing campaign, we get very specific targeting. Not only do we know the intended organization that the threat actor targeted, but over time, especially if we're tracking it at the campaign level, we can derive insights, as in UNC53 was targeting government organizations in Eastern Europe. Secondly, we get oftentimes specific to the individual level that a threat actor is targeting. There have been plenty of cases where threat actors have targeted these same accounts over and over again, not only within specific campaigns, but also across campaigns. We also get the email address that the threat actor used to send the phishing email. And if you remember that earlier campaign that I discussed, where UNC53 was masquerading as European diplomatic entities using Outlook email addresses, now we have something to look for in our email telemetry to try to surface additional phishing emails. We also get themes. UNC53 and other threat actors will have a thematic name in the email subject line, or they'll give thematic names to the attachments in the emails, or maybe the follow-on secondary payloads that are pulled down. Finally, for this type of phishing campaign, this activity is temporally controlled by the adversary. The adversary chooses when to send the phishing email and when to stop sending the phishing email. So we have a very tight and accurate timeline when we have a campaign for this type of activity. Now we'll compare that to UNC53's USB campaign. Our forensic artifacts don't begin until a USB is inserted onto a host and then Mandiant conducts that forensic investigation. Again, while customers anecdotally told us that the infection point was a print shop in Africa or an internet cafe, if we're not conducting the forensic investigation, we can't validate that. So with this, we're unable to establish a chain of custody of that USB from the original infection point being brought into the victim environment. Furthermore, we're unable to establish a chain of custody if that infected USB is moving throughout a corporate environment. We're not going to know until it's inserted, and then a user clicks on it to execute that legitimate file, which begins the infection chain. With this USB-based campaign, this also exemplifies the indiscriminate targeting nature of a USB campaign. If we think back to the 28 different industries that were affected across 16 different countries, if we contrast that with the phishing campaign, which was very specific to geography and industry. And with this USB-based campaign, it relies on unwitting participants. It relies on individuals who are taking USBs and they're inserting it into untrusted hosts and then bringing it back into their corporate environment. Now, while we might hope that this is an unwitting participant, that's not to say that it's a witting participant or an insider threat, but we can't forensically prove or disprove intent. Finally, this type of activity is unbound by time. It's not temporally controlled by the adversary. It's relying on individuals to physically propagate the spread of this campaign. So as we compare a phishing campaign with this USB campaign, we see that the quality of initial infection vector forensic artifacts is much higher for a phishing campaign, and it's rather low for the USB campaign, and it doesn't start until we're able to receive an alert and conduct the investigation on a host. Now, returning to the graph that we started with. However, this time we are including 2023 year to date. And what immediately stands out is when we split between financially motivated threat actors and espionage actors who are utilizing USB-based operations, financial is now only 13%. In 2022, it was 85%. Now, espionage has majority of this activity. And if you recall, in 2022, out of all of the espionage groups who've utilized USB-based operations, 97% were Chinese threat actors. This year in 2023, year to date, 100% are Chinese threat actors. Now looking on the graph at 2023, if we compare it to this time last year, the numbers aren't quite as high, but there's still 3 months left in the year. And if you recall in UNC53's USB-based campaign, there was a lull in the summer months with an uplift in activity in October. So as we approach October, it could be that we continue to see this UNC53 USB campaign propagating, or it's an opportunity for another state-sponsored threat actor to begin a new USB-based campaign. On to conclusions and parting thoughts. Number one, based on the data presented from 2022 and 2023, it's clear USB-based intrusions are back. And if we think about how defenders can better be able to respond to this sort of activity, it's important to have redundant detections, not only throughout the attack lifecycle, but also those malware-specific detections Ray talked about. This will enable defenders to be able to differentiate whether they're facing a financially motivated threat actor executing a USB-based campaign or a state-sponsored threat actor. Second point, distributed global workforces potentially create more risk for organizations, especially with global organizations that have remote employees in regions of the world that China has shown an increased interest in, like Africa or even Southeast Asia. And if we think about the concentration of this activity in regions like Africa, this highlights the security maturity differences between regions throughout the world. Think back 15 years ago where the US military and the defense industrial base fell victim to USB-based intrusions. That infection vector has been locked down, but we're still seeing this concentration in regions like Africa and Southeast Asia. Third point, USB propagation makes analysis and victimology harder. Think back to the comparison between the UNC53 phishing campaign and the UNC53 USB-based campaign. And if we think back to the 28 industries that were affected across 16 countries, that's just very broad targeting and victimology, and it's hard to say whether those were the intended targets by UNC53. Or even thinking back to the print shops or internet cafes in Africa, we're not able to say whether that was the true original infection point that UNC53 was going after. It could just be collateral damage from this activity propagating throughout a region. And because of these 3 points, organizations who may not have Chinese state-sponsored espionage in their threat model may need to consider it. We would like to publicly thank and acknowledge a number of teams who have contributed to this body of research, as well as pursued this threat actor. Here are some additional reading and information sources. We've also included 3 samples available in VirusTotal from each of the 3 SOGU variants that Ray discussed today. We know it's a lot of information, so we've included this on a USB device we've taped under your seat. And if you don't trust USBs after this presentation, we understand, and we've included a QR code to scan. It'll take you to Pastebin, and we have all of these resources posted. With that, we would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and we would like to open up the floor for any questions. Can we go back, please? 2 slides. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. That was great. Just wondering if Mandiant observed any follow-up activity with any targets that might be of interest to UNC53.
I'd like to clarify the question. Are you asking if we saw follow-on activity from UNC53 post this USB campaign?
Correct, against any targets that might have been of particular interest to UNC53.
Not to my knowledge, but there are multiple examples of a singular victim having multiple intrusions from this USB-based campaign.
Great presentation. Have you seen any USB drops in the United States?
We haven't confirmed or been told of specific locations where whether the USB was being dropped or whether it was a singular location where USBs were infected at. We don't have that at this time.
Thanks again, great presentation. I'm trying to think about it from the actor's perspective, and going and using USBs is kind of like you're putting out a very wide net, and you have to kind of, I'm thinking from their perspective, do you have any insight or thoughts on how they go about kind of sifting the wheat from the chaff? They're probably getting lots and lots of data, lots and lots of files back. How do they know whether they've actually met their intended intel gathering targets?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we see a partial answer in the malware. So when it is performing that data theft on that system, the first thing it does is perform a network and host reconnaissance, and it saves that information into the exfiltration file. So along with all those stolen files, there is a file that has details of that system and the network, and that gets copied and exfiltrated to the C2 server. At the same time, we recognize that point. This is a very broad campaign. A lot of data can be coming into these C2 servers, and it's manpower intensive. Even with some automation, you still need people to review the target systems, triage, is this promising or not? Do we do follow-on activities? So I think that kind of hints to a well-resourced campaign and threat actor.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, because if the malware spreads via USB and the domain or IP where it's resolving to is burned, how can the actor bring out a new version of the malware with a new domain where that it is not burned anymore?
Yeah, so for these USB variants, like you're saying, they have a hard-coded IP address in the configuration. So if that IP address gets taken down, there's not going to be an active C2 connection. So a way that they can overcome that is newer malware, newer versions of this malware will have a different configuration. And when these execute and spread, they delete those earlier versions. And that newer version will have a different configuration with a different C2 address. And also after a C2 connection with the malware, it can update its C2 address as well. So there is some flexibility there. I think we have a question in the front. Oh, over there.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I did have a quick question on whether or not there was a trend observed with hardware in terms of the USB devices and such, or was that something that was more out of the scope?
That's a good question. There were no trends observed. It was widespread with different variations. It's a good question.
We're just going to go there first. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, that was a great talk. So question for you. The implication seems to be that they're hoping to land in some air-gapped environments with the USB thing, but if it's air-gapped, how would that C2 functionality be effective?
So if it's air-gapped, after it performs its data exfiltration, those files, copying it to the USB drive, one, it relies on that infected USB drive with those copy files to be inserted into another system with an internet connection. But also, even on the air-gapped system, it's going to beacon out regardless. And we saw in certain investigations at the time, for whatever reason, this malware or this host system that's been infected, the internet connectivity check failed But 2 days later, there was an established connection, and then we saw the staging from USB files to the host system for exfil.
Great content and visualizations, and I wanted to ask if you have gained access to any of the attacker infrastructure, for example, to get more context, confirm further targets, victims of these attacks.
For this, unfortunately, we have not. Our team didn't work to try to access any of the C2 servers.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. This is a question in a more generic sense of SOGU or PlugX. Have you seen the usage of PlugX drop down across the years since the release of ShadowPad? Or is there any PlugX went down and the usage of ShadowPad goes up? Or yeah, what were your thoughts on that? And I guess my second question is also, does the C2 that or the C2s that UNC 53 have any sort of profile? Do they have any preference of ASNs or name servers and stuff like that? Yeah.
Off the bat, onto your question, has there been an increase in ShadowPad and a decrease in SOGU? We have not seen that. As for infrastructure patterns, what ASNs that they're using, I'm not aware of any patterns.
Not on my end. It's not something we digged into. That's a good question. I think part of that is we work in very specialized teams in Mandiant, and that sometimes that falls into another team to dig on the infrastructure. The first question, though, really good question. This is an older backdoor. As these newer versions have come out, like ShadowPad, what we track as poison plug. So what we've kind of seen with this older malware is a lot of times it'll be used as first stage malware, connects to the C2. The threat actors do a triage. Is this a system of interest? And if it is, newer malware gets pulled down. So in one example, when Poison Plug was newer, we saw SOGU first stage, and then Poison Plug come down as second stage.
I will say one more thing onto your question of standing up infrastructure. At Mandiant, a lot of times we'll have incident response or an investigation where it's not immediately apparent that this is UNC 53. And so we'll create a new cluster. And what you're asking, are there patterns in infrastructure, standing up infrastructure? That's something that is a critical component when we merge different clusters together. So even from this campaign, there were many instances where it started off as a different cluster. A team researched that. They looked for those overlaps, those infrastructure overlaps that you're talking about, and we were able to officially merge it into the UNC 53 cluster. So while it's probably accurate what you're saying, and there were many cases of patterns and how they're standing up infrastructure, I can't answer that directly without looking into the information.
One more question.
For the victims, what kind of controls were they using for USB or device control? Only corporate devices? For the air-gapped environments, were they using like kiosks to go from a dirty stick to a clean stick? And were there human error? Is that what happened, or to just not have those processes in place?
Well, there certainly is the human component involved. So the USB will be plugged into a host, but the user must click on that launcher in the USB to start the chain. It needs human interaction. As for some of the controls that you're talking about, now we're wading into areas where Mandiant may have limited or missing information to be able to answer that question directly. And it's obviously so many different victims, so many different customers. It's going to vary widely.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Raymond.
We have one more, or we can take the question offline.